Hello everyone. Welcome to this event. First, let's get started with some housekeeping. This event is being recorded and the recording will be posted online afterward. Speaker biographies and slides are available online at urban.org. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button. All participants are muted, but you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time. Please take 1 to 2 minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event. It's very helpful for us. And lastly, engage with us online using #live@urban. Hi everyone, my name is Sonia Torres Rodriguez. I am a research analyst here at the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. My work here at Urban with Peter Tatian, Mary Bogle, and Michael Cohen has included a collaboration with the 11th Street Bridge Park, a Highline Network member. For over 5 years, we worked with their infrastructure reuse project on creating and tracking progress on their equitable development plan. This work was and remains a field-leading effort to embed equity in infrastructure reuse projects, and you can learn more about it at our website below. We learned a lot of important lessons, including the importance of unifying partners around common goals and the importance of developing strategies that promote power and cultural sustainability for residents of color. These learnings brought us to collaborate with the Highline Network and the Harvard Graduate School of Design to create a way to scale what we had learned in DC in sites across the country. I would like to turn it over to Asima Jansfeld, Managing Director of the Highline Network. She, Anna Traverser-Krajarek, and the rest of their team have been incredible sponsors and partners in more intentionally embedding equity into the built environment and in our communities. Hi, Asima. Can you tell us a little bit about the Highline Network and your work with park organizations?
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you to the Urban Institute for hosting the launch of what we think will be a fundamental set of tools for public space organizations. So I wanted to start just by introducing the Highline Network, which I've led for the past 3 years. We consider it a strategic hub for nonprofit organizations that are reusing infrastructure as public space across North America. We are a program based in the Highline, which is in itself an infrastructure reuse project and also a beautiful public park built on a historic elevated rail line along the west side of Manhattan here in New York City. And when the Highline opened over 10 years ago, our co-founders got lots of questions about how they made it happen. How did you save the rail? How did you raise the money? How did you get city support? And Robert Hammond, the co-founder, one of the co-founders and the executive director at that time, realized we had lots of success stories we could share, but also many lessons learned about what we do differently. Most importantly, on how to best capture the value the Highline Park created for longstanding residents and businesses rather than private developers. And that's really why the network began. And that's why we work to support this group that you see on this slide here of fantastic leaders across North America. They represent all stages of park development. Some have not even put a shovel in the ground, while others are fully operational, like the Highline itself. And we've also been fortunate to grow this community with the philanthropic support of the JPB Foundation since the network's inception, and major support from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for several network initiatives, including the toolkit we're here to talk about today. So our members are constantly thinking about how are we building our city's future? But we also understand, and we talk a lot about this in our toolkit, that it's important to recognize the past, the larger forces that have been rooted well before we started our work, and understanding that as our starting point. Sonia, I know that Urban really helped us in framing that concept in the work that we did on the toolkit together. Could you tell us more about what we mean when we talk about infrastructural racism?
Yeah, definitely. So I highly encourage folks to reference the toolkit website for more detail in the chat. But infrastructural racism is basically a component of systemic racism. It's the laws, regulations, and institutions that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment and the oppression of people of color, especially in the built environment and in our neighborhoods. The 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act is a clear example of how infrastructure development can be racist. The FAHA authorized the planning and construction of tens of thousands of interstate highways, disproportionately tearing up neighborhoods and acting as an enforcement mechanism of racial segregation. This process of physical displacement is typically accompanied by cultural displacement, as Mary Bogle and I write in a Bridge Park publication. And importantly, it has been met with decades-long resistance by communities of color. Here in Washington, D.C., there's a famous phrase, "No white men's roads through black men's homes," from the work of those like Sammy Abbott and Reginald Booker, protesting the building of an interstate over Brooklyn, a black community in DC in the 60s. Basically, every time you step on a sidewalk, get on a highway, or go to a park, you are encountering a calculated infrastructural decision, and very frequently one that is the product of infrastructural racism. So Asima, back to you. Can you tell us a little bit about the Community First Toolkit and how it aims to change how people in this space think and ultimately counter infrastructural racism?
Yeah, so of course, this is the pivotal question that's really at the center of the work that we do with park organizations. Ultimately, how do we show that we're making a difference in countering generations-long impacts on our urban landscapes and building community trust? And so when we started exploring this question as a network a few years ago, we thought we needed to start with metrics about how we hold ourselves accountable on the areas we and our neighbors care about. And so we did. Back in 2016, we worked with a consultant to help us develop a framework of what we were calling equitable impacts to help our members set equity goals. And our members looked at this and they pushed back. They realized that these were great, good end goals, but they didn't know where to start. So we knew we had to take a couple of steps back and build the systems that allow us to actually get to impact and measurement and to ensure that it was practitioner based. So we're really thankful to 15 of our members, which you can see here representing different sizes and scales across our country, that raised their hands over the past 2 years to take risks and experiment with us in building these systems for the larger field and resulting in what you're going to hear about today. We also needed, we knew we needed the members to help us figure this out, but we also needed deep expertise and research to support that work. And that's where Harvard's Graduate School of Design and Urban Institute came in. Stephen Gray, who you'll hear from in a little while, and his course, Urban Design and the Color Line, supported each member with in-depth analysis of the history, community partnerships, and context of each park organization. And Sonia, the work that you and your teammates at Urban did was really to come in and coach each network member after that on the practical implementation side. Can you tell us a bit more about the coaching process and how it evolved over those 2 years?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of learning as always. The role of the coaching process was really to transition the fantastic work of the Harvard students into concrete, actionable, and measurable goals that promote equitable development. So the process detailed on this slide included 4 coaching sessions over 5 months to assist the sites with the drafting and implementation of their action plans. Naturally, over the course of the coaching, we formalized tools that we revisited again and again in our coaching and that we were excited to share today. In the second year, coaching evolved to include much more peer learning so that we could do our part in fostering a stronger culture of equitable planning across the nation. And additionally, it included a strong focus on community engagement because it doesn't really make sense to do this work without being in partnership with community. Although this work led to a tailored, responsive, and supported environment for the sites we worked with, we believe it's important to continue scaling up these approaches and that with the right set of tools, others might be able to also replicate our process. So that's a big reason of why I'm so excited about today. And a big round of applause for today's launch of the Community First Toolkit, which is the culmination of years of intentional work to reshape how we approach equitable development. Can you tell us a little bit more about the toolkit, Asima?
I'd be very happy to. So we're really excited about this as well. And in the chat, you'll see a link to the website itself, which you'll see the homepage up here. And the best way to really experience it is for you to go in, to click around and check out all the links yourself. We're really excited about it. But there are 2 recommended starting points that I'll offer. One is that you could scroll to the bottom left corner of the homepage that you see here and download the introductory booklet, which it gives a great overview. It talks a little bit about what Sonia and I have been talking about and shares 19 stories of real life implementation. And once you've done that and you're ready to start exploring the tools and see how they fit into your own work, click on you see the big start guide button that's in the bottom of this screen here. So when we talk about this and say that it's both a process and a set of tools, You'll see here what I mean. The process boils down to what we see as 5 essential steps that every park organization must undertake in some way to embed equity in their work. So if you're not examining the history of your place before you arrived, or centering equity in the mission and values of your organization, or ensuring internal processes reflect what you seek externally in your community, or building partnerships that align with your values and goals, you can never get to the ensuring progress and reporting success to your stakeholders. So today, we'll be focusing on 3 stories of network members whose individual journeys have directly informed what the toolkit looks like today. They're all at various stages of embedding equity in their work, but hopefully not a spoiler, we see it's consistently about putting community first. And while you listen to the conversations between each coach and network member, we'll be adding links in the chat to the relevant tools so you can follow along and see how you might incorporate that into your own work. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sonia to introduce our first conversation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're very excited about this, so stick around. And our first conversation will be led by Peter Tatian, Senior Fellow here at the Urban Institute in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center, and Rebecca Cordes-Chan, Executive Director at Friends of the Real Park. Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. And thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Asima, for that great introduction. And let me welcome Rebecca here to this conversation. It's great to be talking with Rebecca. I had the privilege of working with her and her team during the Community First Toolkit coaching process. So wonderful to hear more about some of your work and share that with everyone today. So Rebecca, let's just start off. If you could tell the audience a little bit more about Philadelphia's Real Park and what role your organization, the Friends of Real Park, plays.
Certainly. And hi, Peter, good to see you too. And just thank you to the Highline Network, Urban Institute, and of course our partners at the Harvard GSD program for having me here today and for working with us over the course of the last couple of years on this project and important work. So the Rail Park is a vision for a 3.1-mile linear park and pathway that will reuse historic Reading and Pennsylvania railroad lines. These are dating back to the early 1800s, but still, present in contemporary Philadelphia. The rail lines that we're interested in reusing cross through Center City, Philadelphia, spanning more than 50 city blocks, 10 different neighborhoods, and are comprised of 3 major sections. So there's the viaduct, which is the elevated portion of the park. It's about a mile long. A section known as the Cut, which is below grade but open to the sky, and it's flanked on both sides by historic stone walls. And finally, the Tunnel, which is, as its name would suggest, a tunnel. It actually goes underneath the Ben Franklin Parkway in Philly, underneath some of the city's most major cultural institutions. The kind of path nearly links river to river in the city, and as I mentioned, has the opportunity to link some of the major cultural and anchor institutions in the city. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I should note that a quarter mile of the park is complete. It opened in 2018. And this first phase of the park, which we refer to as phase 1, it's an elevated section, serves as a really nice proof of concept for the project. It's important that I note this was a partnership, or the kind of development of the first phase was a partnership between Center City District, which is a high capacity bid and foundation operating in
La
Center
primera
City.
una licitación de alto volumen.
I'm getting a little bit of the interpretation here, but I'm just going to keep talking. So Center City District, the City of Philadelphia's Park and Recreation and Streets departments, numerous philanthropic partners in Philadelphia and beyond, and of course, Friends of the Rail Park, my organization, which at the time of phase 1's opening in 2018 was just hiring its first professional staff. But up until that moment, and for the 10 years prior, had been entirely volunteer run. And it's just really important to note that these projects take a very long time to bring to life. And it's because of the dedication of those partners that phase 1 exists and that we are able to continue to advocate for the future phases of the park as well. My organization, Friends of the Rail Park, today I'm happy to report that we are now a staff of 4. We have a board of directors and some very active volunteer committees. Our work is remains heavily dependent on partnerships with both the city and a whole slew of partners from the arts and culture, community, the private sector, and of course the community development space in Philadelphia as well. There's 3 pillars to our work as Friends of the Rail Park. There's the stewardship and programming of phase 1. We also serve as kind of a communications partner, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, I'm sure, as we continue this conversation. We are also planning, fundraising, and advocating for the development of the full vision of the rail park. Our latest cost estimate put it at about $200 million to develop the full thing. I don't even want to know what that looks like with inflation now, but our next phase is pegged at about $40 million. So we have a lot of funding to raise, but we are kind of on our way. And then the final body of our work is creating and developing our equitable development agenda. Very much looking at and in response to being part of the Highline Network, but ensuring that residents in Philadelphia are able to not only access the benefits of green space, which I think probably everyone on this call is well aware of, but also to be able to access the benefits of the investment in the park itself. So how are we thinking about creating the pathways and partnerships to ensure that our community members are not only not being displaced by the development of the rail park, but are able to take advantage of that investment? So I think I'll pause there because I'm sure we have a lot more questions and things that we want to talk about.
No, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful overview. And so as you mentioned, the rail park is going to be a little over 3 miles long when it's fully completed. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the communities that the rail park is going to intersect?
Sure. So 3 miles long, geographically speaking, I always say more than 10 neighborhoods because Philadelphia, you never want to say it's only 10 because inevitably there'll be one, micro neighborhood within it. But just to give you a sense of what some of these neighborhoods are like, this is everything from Chinatown and some of the last kind of biplex neighborhoods and anchor institutions in Center City to some of the wealthiest and most well-established neighborhoods as well. There are some neighborhoods that have some fairly rapidly changing demographics from a residential standpoint, where there was a lot of vacancy, even 5-10 years ago, and that those vacancy numbers are beginning to decline. There are other areas where, our cultural institutions, I'm talking about the Barnes and the Rodin Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Franklin, those are kind of the dominant kind of actors or institutions in those neighborhoods, and there's not as much residential in those parts of town. Certain parts of the park are also very close to City Hall, Reading Terminal Market, the Convention Center, areas that are highly, trafficked by tourists and visitors to the city. There's also a number of educational institutions. So this is everything from our Community College of Philadelphia, numerous public middle and high schools, universities. We have hospitals. We have quite a few senior living communities, which I'm only now discovering now that we're beginning to engage in this work. And that's just kind of like geographically speaking, thinking about who's in these neighborhoods and what their kind of interests are. But again, as I'm sure a lot of people on this call are aware of, parks and public spaces also have a lot of communities that are organized thematically and aren't necessarily tied to place. And we're beginning to dig into that a lot as well. So this is everything from people who are really interested in gardening and urban agriculture. And Philly, unfortunately, a lot of our urban agricultural spaces are feeling a lot of development pressure currently. And we've actually lost, I think, more than 144 in the last year. There's also people who are attracted to the park, and we consider stakeholders because of their attraction to kind of the natural and environmental elements of the space. There's of course the arts and cultural communities, plural, who are looking for space to show their work to the public, to kind of be in space and to use, and they just need space for exhibiting, for performance, etc. And then of course, health and wellness is a thing that we're thinking about as well. So people who are looking for space to run, to ride a bike, to sit outside and meditate, whatever it may be that brings you out there. So we think about the neighborhood or the communities that we touch rather, both geographically as well as thematically.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it sounds so quite a cross section of Philadelphia that's part of your constituency for this park. And you noted that many of these communities are changing with new development and new residents appearing. And I imagine the rail park is going to attract more investment and more people to the area. So what kinds of equity challenges does that pose, and how are you thinking about responding to those challenges?
Yeah. So there was a report that was actually completed in, I think, summer of 2020 by our colleagues at the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation in partnership with PolicyLink and Sojourner Consulting. That report showed that phase 1 of the rail park had already triggered I think it was between 16 and 22% increase in property values within the 10-minute walk shut of the park. And that of course disperses, the further away you get from the park, which is why I say 16 to 22%. But that's an awesome opportunity, and it's also a challenge, depending on how you look at it and who you are as a stakeholder. And so as friends of the rail park, we think about physical, cultural, and economic displacement rather than just like throwing out the term of gentrification. And what are the strategies within each one of those buckets that we need to think about and respond to? And I'll be honest, with where we are right now in terms of our overall planning process, our staff capacity, we're fairly limited at this point to kind of thinking about cultural displacement and how we can address and respond to that. So how are we, given our resources and the fact that phase 1 is complete, how are we making people feel welcome on phase 1 of the rail park, kind of celebrating the diversity of experience and histories that are present there. Phase 1 is right at the kind of intersection of the Callow Hill neighborhood of Philadelphia and Philadelphia's Chinatown. And so how are we creating programming that speaks to the people who live, work, and go to school in those neighborhoods? The physical and economic challenges are a little more difficult to respond to, and at this stage we have less control over, but a thing that we're really planning for and moving ahead with, and what was really foundational as being a part of the EIF cohort is our plan to create an equitable development agenda. So understanding existing planning and community development context and how investment in the park will exacerbate or could potentially mitigate or even be an asset to the goals and strategies within that kind of planning community economic development context. And so I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's kind of the goal is to understand existing organizations and entities that are already doing the work in our footprint in the neighborhoods that we want to be a part of, and understanding that they have expertise that we don't have. Also, why would we recreate the wheel when there's potentially a partnership or capacity that we could even add to those organizations? And how can we work towards a mutual vision for community investment at the organizational level, but then that is kind of experienced by and taken advantage of by the communities that the rail park will touch, and that a lot of these organizations are also already working in, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. So that was, I think, part of the work we did together on the the coaching portion of the Community First work. And part of that was, as you were just mentioning, assessing partnerships and thinking about both existing partners and new partners, how to create partnerships around aligned interests. And that's the subject of one of the tools in the toolkit, the Align with Partners tool. So can you tell us something a bit more about how you approached creating and strengthening partnerships around your shared equity goals?
So I guess I will use the kind of the experience of the EIF as how we approach this, because to be honest, that's what we did. When we started the EIF process, I will just disclose that I was new to the rail park. I started right before the pandemic started, and to further complicate things, we had a lot of staff transition. And so from a partnership perspective, we were basically starting from scratch. There was a lot of kind of like email introduction, but there weren't a lot of existing relationships to go off of. And so we were also really looking at a reboot of the organization at the start of the coaching process. And so when we started, even pre-pandemic, pre-EIF pilot, the original idea was to host a series of community listening sessions covering the 10 plus neighborhoods, and then to pair that with qualitative data and demographic data, and of course look at existing neighborhood and community plans. And then we thought that this kind of exercise and synthesis of all this data would be the basis of our equitable development agenda. Admittedly, with the pandemic, we had to rethink a lot of that and what a community session even looks like when you're doing everything virtually. And so we chose to focus our work through the EIF on kind of the foundational data collection and landscape scan of the existing neighborhood plans. And we were able to focus our coaching on creating that landscape scan, and actually several people on this call actually were super helpful and fundamental and foundational rather in putting all that together. But looking at the full 3-mile vision for the rail park and the neighborhood it traverses, and not just focusing on phase 1 or where we think the next phase might be, but really thinking about kind of the scale and the opportunity there. And that these kind of almost like cliff notes from the scan would then be the foundation of the rest of our planning process. With the pandemic, we had to put those listening sessions on hold, as well as kind of assessing this kind of partner capacity. But where we shifted was to actually develop a cultural asset map. And this is actually the the topic of our section of the brief of the toolkit. So I call it a cultural asset map, but to the public it's known as the Rail Park Time Capsule. This was done with a grant from the Knight Foundation. We were able to work with Folder Studios, which is a design firm based out of LA, but they work nationally, to design a digital and interactive cultural asset map and public history archive that was focused on the neighborhoods that the Rail Park is a part of. We launched this after many months of planning about a year ago. And the idea is that if you are a person who lives or works or go to school in the Rail Park footprint, you are invited to contribute a hope, a dream, a thing you love about your neighborhood that is either related to the Rail Park or public space or just your neighborhood in general. And the contributions we've gotten so far are everything from people who are a little bit older and remember actually riding the train line when it was still active into the city as young people, to people who remember temporary art installations that were on the Rail Park or in their neighborhood, or maybe got married, or have ideas about how they want the park to function in the future. The submissions are in a variety of mediums. We have everything from drawings, we have videos, we have some people submitted audio clips, which is really interesting, or photos of artifacts from the neighborhood that they want to be remembered in this archive. And I think this has really shown to the public that we are interested and value this kind of multitude and diversity of perspectives on the park. Even at this early stage of, a next phase of the Rail Park is at best, 3 to 5 years out, just given like how long it takes to, design and construct and build these things. But that we're really investing in and putting resources towards this kind of public input and community input process early on. I will say this work is still in progress. We have a lot of work to do. And the other thing I just want to note too is that on the back end, these public submissions that we're collecting are feeding into our broader equity agenda and master planning process for the Rail Park itself. Running parallel to that process, we're also working on a discrete capacity mapping exercise. So I had mentioned that we had to push a lot of that aside, but we're reincorporating it now in the months ahead, and we've actually started this as well. But really looking at let me back up for just a second. So the time capsule is mostly focused on individuals. The capacity mapping is more focused on kind of organizations and other institutions and potential partners in our footprint. So running parallel to the time capsule exercise, this capacity mapping exercise is helping us to understand who are the potential partners in our footprint that are a good fit from a thematic or kind of mission alignment perspective, who has capacity to actually work with us and who actually wants to work with us as the Rail Park. And those 3 questions, you'll be surprised about who kind of falls by the wayside, but it's been super helpful for us to do that, even in a discrete and not super formal way, but as we begin to formalize it a little bit more, seeing who's actually willing and able to come to the table. This is all leading into our launch of a formal equitable development planning process that's running parallel to the things I already said we're running parallel to, but that will really be focused on the second phase of the Rail Park and its design process, and then again looking at the full kind of scope and scale of the Rail Park and the opportunities there.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. I think that's a really wonderful example of doing some deep community engagement work. We put a link to the Time Capsule project in the chat, so really encourage people to check that out as a great model for them to look at. And it is also doing that community asset mapping is one of the tools in the toolkit, Community First Toolkit, so you can also find some other guidance there on how to do that process. So I want to we have a few questions from the audience that I'd like to turn to. And as also a reminder, if folks have questions at any time during any of these discussions, please put them in the Q&A box. But we have, first question is, what are some of your biggest challenges when it comes to embedding equity in your work, especially with fundraising and getting buy-in from staff, is the way the person worded it, but I think there's probably a lot of people you need to get buy-in from. So,
yeah. So I actually don't have a big problem or like pushback from staff. My staff are very on board, and I think it's kind of communicated pretty explicitly in the interview process that if you're not about this might not be the right place for you. So haven't had a lot of pushback there. I think, more broadly speaking, a lot of the pushback I've received has been because of the mindset of if we pursue this work, it means that someone will lose out in this process. And I don't think that's necessarily true. And it's kind of explaining, especially around the equitable development planning process. The pushback I've also gotten is that it's mission creep. It's you're a staff of 4 people. How will you possibly build the community land trust that a equitable development plan is going to call for? And it's like, no, like we're not actually saying that Friends of the Rail Park should start the community land trust. What we're trying to say is there are entities and organizations in Philadelphia that do have that expertise and capacity, and how can we be working in alignment with those groups? I think the other kind of pushback or challenges we received are around some of the jargon that's used. And so that's kind of my overall recommendation with this process in general, is to demystify, de-jargon, just use really like plain language, if that makes sense. And I realize I'm talking to like an Urban Institute crowd, but the more we can kind of break down what we mean when we say something like an equitable development plan or the goals or the metrics and everything, and we can just break down like what we're really talking about and getting at with this, the better. And that usually helps kind of decrease people's anxieties around this work. And also that for us as the Rail Park, because we are so early on in our planning process and our development process as well, this is actually an opportunity for us to, kind of ideally get ahead of any, kind of challenges or problems or unintended consequences that we might experience down the line. We have the luxury of being able to learn from other members of the Highline Network in terms of best practices, in terms of what we should be doing now and planning for now. And so I think that's also helped assuage a lot of people's kind of current concerns or fears.
I think using plain language, that's a great message for an urban crowd. So thank you for sharing that.
No disrespect.
No,
I want my grandma
okay.
to be able to understand what I'm talking about when I'm like, yeah, this is what we're working on.
Absolutely. No, I agree 100%. Another question we got was about the role that city staff played in the work you're doing, particularly around supporting the 5 sections of the tool. And can you say a little bit more about the city government role and what that's been like?
Yeah, and I apologize for not giving them more kudos at the start of this the presentation, but so I should be clear that phase 1 of the rail park is still owned by our transit authority. The land itself is owned by our transit authority. It is leased, and I think 100-year lease to the City of Philadelphia's Parks and Recreation Department, who then comes in and does kind of the day-to-day operations, the trash removal, the they tend to the plants, they replant things, they turn the irrigation on, the kind of day-to-day operations of phase 1. And then we come in to just provide any additional resources that we can. And again, those kind of programming and communication pieces. That is a model we are hoping to replicate for future phases, to be determined. We're kind of going through those exercises right now to understand what the governance of a future phase of the rail park needs to look like. But the intention is for this to always be a public park in one form or the other. And so I would say the other thing that we're kind of wrapping our heads around is what other agencies within city government do we need to be talking to? So that, to me, that's Office of Transportation and Infrastructure. That's potentially our development or redevelopment authority. It's thinking about this as, yes, a park, but also an infrastructure reuse project. And so who else can we be talking to really build momentum around the project? And I guess the short answer is to be determined for phase 2. But yeah, we've had great support from the city so far, and I'm just really thankful for that.
Great, thanks so much. Well, we could spend a lot more time talking, I know, and there's so much to discuss. And but I want to thank you, Rebecca, again for sharing all the work that you've done, and again invite people to check out more about Rail Park and your equity work as a great model for them to look at. We're going to turn things over now to our next discussion. And I want to introduce my former Urban Institute colleague, Michael Cohen, who is now an associate at Lafayette Square. And he is going to be talking with James Warren, who is a board member for the Richmond Bridge Park Foundation.
Hey, y'all. Hey, James. Great to see
Hey,
you
Michael.
again.
Good to see you.
You're back in conversation. So just to kick us off, James, can you give us just a overview of what the Richmond Bridge Park project is?
Sure. And as I do, just want to express gratitude for this amazing journey and effort that we've been able to work on together over the past couple of years. It's been hugely impactful for us. So what is Richmond Bridge Park? First, I should say we're still in development. We've moved from concepting through the planning phase and are now moving into design. As fully imagined, Bridge Park is really a system of interconnected public spaces with bridges, both literal and symbolic, at its heart in the city of Richmond, Virginia. To speak to the literal, the centerpiece of Bridge Park will be on the Manchester Bridge, which crosses the historic James River, and adjacent spaces sort of north and south of the river that would provide equitable access to this sort of centerpiece or heart of Bridge Park, especially for some of Richmond's most excluded, ignored, and disinvested neighborhoods, while also facilitating connection for all of Richmond's communities, both geographic and identity-based. This centerpiece will be a new public space that reuses existing infrastructure. So one of the city's bridges has significant excess capacity. And the extended footprint, we are advocating to coincide with a trail system that will connect residents and visitors to some of Richmond's most culturally and historically significant neighborhoods and sites. I spoke about the symbolic, and just to touch on that for a moment, Richmond and the James River in particular, I'd say they embody sort of the history of our nation with all of its pain and its promise. And so the bridge, in a physical sense, but also symbolically, overlooks the ruins, the burned bridges of the fleeing Confederate Army. In its footprint, the Bridge Park vision encompasses neighborhoods that have been affected or, in some cases, erased through redlining, through new development of highways and buildings. Parking lots cover historical sites. And the James River now has flowing alongside on both of its banks as it goes through downtown Richmond, just a tremendous amount of development, new construction and economic development on both of its banks. And so while that is inspiring on one hand, intention must really be applied to ensure that this development is in fact inclusive and equitable and doesn't either repeat or structurally reinforce the equities that exist in the first place in the current environment. So at Bridge Park, we are really seeking to be a catalyst of change that surfaces these untold stories of these communities and neighborhoods, that connects them or reconnects them to the broader region in an equitable and accountable way, and ultimately creates a space for all of Richmond's residents and visitors, but with a distinct emphasis on Black folks whose spaces and places have been reduced or erased over time.
Yeah, see, James, this is why I could listen to you talk all day about this kind of work. And I love that idea, that concept of bridges, both literal and figurative, because you're thinking about this in a very connected way. And I think when we first met you all, that was the thing that most impressed me, that, just to, underline for folks, y'all are still pretty early on in your process,
right?
But you came in with a very clear vision about doing this connective work, about a focus on equity, about a focus on the sort of Black folks whose stories might not have been told in other places. And so I'm wondering how that, as you were thinking about this project early on, how did that come up for you all?
Sure. I've been involved with Bridge Park for, I guess, about three years now, 2.5, 3 years, and I became the chair at the start of this year. But I knew about Bridge Park going back several years, which was what attracted to me. As Rebecca said previously, these are long-term initiatives. So sometimes if you don't have the patience to do the foundational work, it probably isn't for you, because it can take a decade in the foundational space to really get enough people to shift their view of what's possible. One of the people who really played a leadership role in that is our president, Ted Elmore. And he left his corporate career and gave himself fully to this work. And I think in the beginning of that, he probably, like many, saw Bridge Park as an opportunity to reimagine public space, reuse public space, create green space, do the things that we see happening in a lot of places. And as he started to go out and talk to the community, he heard people say, need more than that, need more than just, a nice looking park for people to sort of walk and bike on and see the river, need this project to make a difference and address some of the past inequity, which is a lot of weight if you're not prepared to go about it. And so I think what Ted demonstrated is what it means to be truly, he's a white man of privilege, and he leads with acknowledging that and says, so how do I shift and share my power and my influence? And I think that permeates outward to the board, to our volunteers, and it attracted people like me to this work. And now we have a very much of a, throughout our board and our volunteers, a completely shared and aligned vision for what Bridge Park can be and represent in its fullest. But I think the reason why equity has become such a strong focus is the people who've been attracted to work with Bridge Park, I think, bring that sensibility and the understanding of how important that is. And the community has been very, very vocal in this process. We've asked them to be vocal. We've made space and opportunity for them to share their voice. And frankly, even sometimes when you don't, this community in Richmond knows how to make itself heard, as it has on any number of projects over the years. So I think that intersection of leadership, volunteer advocates, and the community, if you can start to form alignment right off the bat among those key constituencies, you can center this work in the principles and practices of equity.
No, definitely. Here. I think I saw one of the questions earlier was asking about, where does, stakeholder meetings come in the process? Where do community meetings come in the process? And I think this shows the value of having those kind of that community engagement up front and sort of ongoing throughout the work.
Almost to a point of us saying, to us, it should never stop. There's never a phase of community engagement. It should be an ongoing practice. I think we should dedicate resources and infrastructure to that being part of not just what we do, but how we do it, so that the community really does feel and see and play back. This is not just us being included. This is for us. This is by us. We have helped design this. And I think that's the difference between where these projects need to go and maybe where some of them have been in the past.
No, definitely. And it was very clear from the jump that y'all had thought a lot about this, because I think one of the first sessions we were talking about vision, and you all had like a full-on document. We're talking housing, economic development, small business. And so I think one of the first things that we thought about was how do we narrow this down to what are you trying to do? What is your theory of change? Which I think Anna just plopped the toolkit for that, the tool for that in the chat. But how do you have a sort of clear theory of change while not sort of sacrificing this sort of big expansive vision? And so I'm curious how you felt as we worked through that process.
Totally. I mean, we're a visionary crew, and we love our principle, we love our vision, we love our ideas. And I think this is another example of just when you're building out a team, even if it's a team of volunteers before you have staff, it's so easy to assume that the only people you need at this stage are visionary people. You need people who also are going to challenge you to wrestle it to the ground, who are going to say, this is great, but how will we do this? Or what would this look like? And that's what our board and our volunteers look like today. So really the diverse experiences of people who you might be tempted to say, I don't want to engage them yet because they're going to water things down. No, if the vision is what it is, it will persist. And as you bring people in they're not challenging it per se, they're strengthening it, they're making it more tangible. So that's what I think we worked through very much interpersonally. And I like to say it's all about the pendulum. If you're predisposed to being too far in the weeds, you need somebody to help level you up. And if you're predisposed to being too up there in blue sky, you need somebody to help you bring it to the ground. And I think that's a very big piece of what you all did. You helped us, start to wrestle it to the ground without diluting it. And I think that was, we'll talk about it in a moment, but that was the work.
Yeah, that was the work. And it was, you know, it was definitely work, but I think we got to like a really good place. And I'm curious, you know, one of the first steps of that process of wrestling it to the ground, I think, was building out a work plan that highlighted what are the, you know, given that you're really early in your process, what are some of the early tasks? What are some of the early, you know, wins that you can sort of work through to help, you know, build out the actual steps of doing this work? And so I'm curious, you know, from your perspective, you know, how did you sort of identify those first steps? What were those first steps for you all?
Well, it starts with going through the process of defining and documenting the theory of change, which you all really helped facilitate us through. And just for the benefit of our attendees, our theory of change states that because of the history of exclusion of Black and Brown communities from much of the region's growth initiatives, we are about Black and Brown community placemaking and placekeeping to ensure that the benefits and the power culturally, economically, and civically that are derived from Bridge Park flow equitably to Black and Brown neighborhoods. And so then the question is, well, what does that look like as far as work? And I would say there's two key aspects. One is ongoing piece of strategic work, and one is continuing the engagement. So some of it was really starting to create a more detailed shared understanding, not just of the theory of change, but of the underlying equity work in it, especially among our broader group of volunteers, advocates, et cetera. Many of our team have experience doing equity work, either as part of our jobs or in the community or as a facet of what we do. But while some of us had that experience fashioning this kind of work for others, it varied a lot. And it's really hard to turn that lens on yourself. So that I would say was organizationally a big piece of work and one of the actionable, concrete actionable steps. And we're still doing that. We're still making sure that everyone within that sort of first two tiers of engagement are continuing to align with it, help extend it out, build it out, and then looking for ways where we can activate it. There's two key pieces that we're activating on it. One is continuing to do the community engagement work, because again, to us, that doesn't have a start or an end. And then the other is really embedding equity in our strategic plan and in our current phase of advocacy and outreach work with a variety of key stakeholders, primarily government, business, and civic leaders, so that we can advance the recommended design for Bridge Park. And that process is one of continuing to, at a high level and then at a very actionable level, both talk about and demonstrate how equity is embedded in the design of Bridge Park. So a lot of the features that we are advocating for, a lot of the principles of where things, literal footprints are, or access points are, all of those are rooted and grounded in this theory of change and in our beliefs around equity being central to everything we do. And it also continues to mean showing up and engaging and amplifying the community voices when we have these discussions, because that not every conversation is a conversation of 50 or 100 or 200 people. Sometimes it's a conversation of 3, but you still need to be in a position to really amplify and bring forward the voice of the community, especially the Black and Brown community, so that those needs and preferences are being heard when people are not even making their decision, but when they're thinking about making their decision. You can start to seed some of those voices in their thinking. And so that's a big part of what we're doing right now to really bring that equity plan in general and our overall strategic plan to life.
Yeah, and so, you know, I remember the meeting in which the sort of phrase placekeeping came up, and as soon as I think we heard that, it felt like a very, very apt statement of what you all were doing. And so I'm curious, as you are in these different meetings and you've talked about, you know, being that sort of community voice, or bringing that community voice even in smaller conversations, I'm wondering how you, as you have all of this feedback, stakeholders, community members, how do you process it? How do you sort of, you know, blend it all together?
So some of this is the kind of work that I love to do in general, which is, you know, really thinking about stakeholder perspective in how it informs design or strategy or vision, and then connecting that back out to stakeholders to say, is this manifesting the way you intended? Did we miss something? What else is out there? So, I mean, it sounds like I might be repeating myself, but I fundamentally believe you have to build those processes and those loops in upfront. Because when you do that, you're also declaring your intent to everyone. Like, we are doing this with the community at the center of it. And so it's less of a, hey, how do we navigate these trade-offs? And we heard some tough feedback. You know, how do we convince the community to sort of change its point of view on this? It's more, how do you continue through practice and process to really build alignment around a shared vision, and then build alignment around what the roadmap for that vision looks like. And so I think, you know, whenever there seems to be a question, what I go to is I ask myself, are we seeing something new that would cause us to kind of revisit our vision or theory of change? Or is this an opportunity to strengthen the engagement and the alignment between these two constituencies who maybe might be hearing each other for the very first time? And so we can facilitate some of that dialogue and engagement while not even necessarily, while not compromising the very reason why that dialogue needs to take place in the beginning. And that's often because those voices and those perspectives and those lives have been excluded from the developments that have proceeded to date. So it is a shift, and it is a shift for the stakeholders that you're engaging. It's definitely a shift for some of the communities that you're bringing to conversations that, you know, in some cases there's maybe generational mistrust. In other cases, there's a sense of apathy. In other cases, there's like, I don't need them. Who cares? We got this. We're gonna build it on our own. And so you often find yourself saying, how do we respect those needs and lived experiences and continue to help everyone ultimately connect to and move towards this shared vision? Which if you're doing that the right way, it's no longer about you or us or we. It's really, you're just a steward of the process of helping this vision come to life. And I very much see that as my role. And I think I speak for my fellow volunteers on the board, that being what they see as a steward of bringing this to life, versus you know, sort of dead set, come hell or high water, we're gonna make this thing happen the way we want it to be. It's not about that. There's so much development in the world we live in today that is the result of, I'm going to make this happen come hell or high water. We're living with it. We're living
Sure,
with,
that's how we got here.
with folks doing this. So we have to make a shift to that.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. And I see a question here that I think aligns with one of my questions. So we're just going to go in on it. So how, you know, in thinking about this community engagement, how do you all structure it? There's a question about, you know, sometimes the people who are maybe the most engaged, or they're, you know, well, seeing the person who's in every single meeting,
yeah,
and is always taking up space. How do you structure those in that community engagement? How do you make sure that folks who maybe are disconnected, how do you access them? How do you do outreach? Yeah, what does that look like for you all?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll answer it both in terms of the things that we've done at Bridge Park and my perspective on it more broadly. I think you got to be willing. Some of this stuff stops becoming sequential and starts becoming sort of, you know, three-dimensional. You've got to be willing and able to move in a few different places at the same time. So what do I mean by that? You might go to that very first community engagement. Maybe you're able to sort of ask people to come to a conversation and talk about Bridge Park, or we have sort of a 20-foot model of Bridge Park as was originally conceived, and that is it's a show that goes on the road. We've since added other tools and mechanisms to help people see what Bridge Park could be in its fully imagined state and then contribute. So most of that work pre-pandemic was in-person community conversations, and everything from storefronts to offices to community centers, churches, libraries, everything in between. And we go to the community. Probably if you were to measure the breadth of perspective we were hearing in the beginning versus later in the process, it'd be like this compared to this, because when you're starting out, it's not just that you don't know what you don't know who you don't know. You don't know who's already like, I've been doing this work for 50 years. Why are you coming around now? You don't know who's going to say, I've been waiting for something to galvanize us. Can I contribute? You don't know any of those voices or perspectives until you ask. And so the beginning, I think, has all of it is a humbling process, but you especially need to approach it with a sense of humility. And almost the message is, I'm here because I have a belief in the possibilities that could sort of restore or energize or amplify what you say you care about and what you need. Am I wrong in that is the first question. What am I presuming in that is the second question. And so if you start to design your first set of conversations to, as quickly as possible, reveal what you don't know and who you don't know, you get to the second set of conversations faster. Sometimes the stakeholders in that second group aren't necessarily willing to dialogue with you, but there might be intermediaries who can be the voices of the community to you, or can be the voices of the project to the community. And so now it's a question of saying, hey, how do you honor and respect their role? Because you don't want them to feel conflicted or compromised. You want them to feel supported as they are trying to bridge two groups. And so, that is really about power sharing in its most literal. That's saying we can't presume or script the answer or the outcome. If we truly seek to learn and be informed by the needs and the voices of the community, then we have to be willing to accept what the answers may be when they come. And when you lead with that clarity and that intention, I think it makes a new kind of space for people to say, okay, all right, if let's see if you're really real, but at least you're asking the right questions. That doesn't happen in just a couple of weeks or a couple of months. That's been a several years process to build that kind of trust, where now if we do go and say, hey, we want to get some, here's the thing that we're contemplating, or here's what we've learned in this phase of the engagement. How would this impact you? Is this what you want? Now we can go back and have those conversations, maybe a little bit faster than the beginning, because some of the trust has been built or some of the relationships have been established. The last thing I'll say is we were very, very intentional about demonstrating equity on our board. Because we are still in planning phase, we don't have a staff. We have a full-time volunteer staff of one in our executive director. And we have a lot of board members who I say are functioning not just in a governance role, but an ambassador role. Their team members roll up the sleeves. And so because of that, we need to make sure that the board reflects the community that we seek to serve. And we've been very intentional about bringing people into the board who represent a variety of different lived experiences and backgrounds and identities, empowering them to not only be an ambassador for Bridge Park, but to help shift and expand what we think Bridge Park is. If you can lead with that kind of intention and authenticity, I think that shows up in how you engage, how you structure your engagements, where your engagements take place, and who's participating in them.
Yeah, wow, I hope folks are taking notes. I love the 3D vision of how this works. Y'all are out here playing 3D chess. So
well, that's the world we live in, right? So if the world's been playing 3D chess, we got to show up and start playing 3D chess too.
Got to level up. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. I see something here about, so you mentioned part of what you're thinking about is the storytelling, community storytelling process. And I'm wondering if you've thought about, what does that look like? How do you hope to document these stories? How do you hope to share these stories back out?
Definitely. I believe we're blessed on our board, very fortunate. There are a number of people who, by virtue of either their work in the community, their professions creatively, they are not just natural storytellers, they do storytelling work. And so we're sort of an embarrassment of riches, but not egos, which is awesome, right? So we have all of these ideas of ways we could do it. If anything, like you might know with the Bridge Park team, it's more about, okay, that sounds great. How do we get this down to something tangible? So what we are envisioned is a participatory voice of the community event this year that will really focus on members of the communities sharing their stories, really about their neighborhoods, about where they come from, starting to lift up the untold stories, the ones that maybe have been disconnected through redlining or infrastructure development, and say, there was an us here before this was here, or this community used to be like this. We're still preserving those elements, but with maybe unnecessary stress or resource dependency that sort of takes the resources we have instead of letting those resources be used for more generative outcomes. And so those stories, I think it's really, really important that some of those stakeholders I mentioned before, civic, business, and political leaders, many of whom I think are open to and themselves demonstrated leadership in this space, And some of who are at different stages on their journey, they need to hear those stories, and they need to hear them from the people who've lived those experiences, or the people whom they're representing as their ancestors. So often I've heard people say, we got to tell the ancestor stories, and I think that's true. And one of the things that I learned from one of my colleagues in the historical space is, if you really want to tell the ancestor stories, tell their descendants stories, because that's proof that they were here. And again, it's not an either or, it's an and. I think those stories and those voices prove the histories, prove the culture, prove the heritage that sometimes is ignored, or has been, attempts have been made to quite literally pave it over. These stories and voices will start to bring that thing back to life in ways that I think centers and reminds people what's the why of this, and whose voices matter, not at the expense of other voices, but they're voices that you have not heard before or listened to before enough in your previous development decisions. And so we're going to make sure that those voices are heard as some of these decisions proceed going forward.
Yeah, James, it's been a pleasure. I could talk about this stuff all day with you.
And I appreciate you so much and the work you and all of your colleagues have done. I speak on behalf of all of Bridge Park when I just say thank you, thank you, thank you. You've accelerated us in ways that we could not have imagined. And we're here in large measure because of the work you all have invested in us. So thank you.
Yeah, excited to see where you'll go forward. And when your podcast drops, I will be your first follow.
For real.
All right, thanks, James. So next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Gray, who is Associate Professor of Urban Design at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Fantastic colleague, as well as Tony Moore, who is the President and CEO of the Trinity Park Conservancy.
Thank you, Michael. That's going to be a tough act to follow, Tony, so we're going to have to keep it fresh. It's great to be here. It's great to see you. It's great to see so many people joining today for this launch. Let's just start with the basics. Why don't you, if you could just tell us a little bit about Trinity Park Conservancy and your work with Harold Simmons Park. How many people, how long have you existed? Where are you in the process?
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. And first of all, I want to thank you for your hard work. And I wasn't here, but I heard a lot about Brent Merriam and the work he did as well. So I appreciate it for that. But yeah, so the Trinity Park Conservancy, I've been with this organization just shy of a year. And the Trinity Park Conservancy is a conservancy tasked by the city of Dallas to oversee 10,000 acres of the green space, which is where our river sits. And so about 1908, there was a flood that flooded and severely impacted most of Dallas. And the Army Corps of Engineers created these massive levees and rerouted the river for public safety. And it worked tremendously well since the city has not been flooded. The unfortunate challenge with these massive structures is that they literally divided East Dallas, which is our downtown metro Dallas, and West Dallas, which is our poor communities of color, Black and brown, and the disparity between East and West separated by the river was significant. And so the opportunity to build a park literally at the center of this collide that will ultimately unify East and West Dallas, and certainly it's aspirational, but we have to believe that we can do this. But so that will be called the Harold Simmons Park. Will roughly be a 230-acre park, 200 of which will be in the river, roughly 1 linear mile that will have a series of overlooks. The challenge, Stephen and everyone on this call, is that this project started over 20 years ago, and it has had a slow fatigue start for several reasons, some political. And about just shy of 6 years ago, we got our first massive donation of $50 million to get the project going. So I say all that to say there was a sense of fatigue and frustration and what has taken this park so long. both on the community, civic, and city side. I will say that an opportunity that the Army Corps had to work within the floodway where the river is to make it safer. Public safety takes precedent over recreation. And so they told us to stop everything we were doing about in 2019. So where we are today, we have not yet broken ground. We're in the process of finalizing boundaries, purchasing a little bit of land here and there. And we're hoping to have a full public announcement here sometime this year.
That's really good to hear. And you know, when I think about the work that you're doing and the way that you describe the project itself and where it's situated within the community and the history of sort of inequity in the infrastructure and the original infrastructure sort of intervention, it makes me think about, you know, some of the stuff that Sonia was talking about at the beginning, infrastructural racism, and you know, the piece, maybe Anna, if you could put a link in it again to the site that was really heavily drafted by my colleague Caroline Smith, I think really describes the relationship between where people are and who they are and where infrastructure happens. And so your project, the way that you framed it and positioned it, it's literally in the sort of middle of that space. It's literally taking on kind of an equity agenda because of the way you're framing it and because of its geography. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about why that framing and why equity, racial equity, has sort of been important to your organization, and maybe even tell us a little bit about what equity means to your organization, because you know, these words we throw around, but you know, what does it really mean to Trinity Park?
You know, I often say 30 years ago, when you built a park, you got the brightest minds, the brightest designers, you put them in a room and they benchmark nationally, they build a park, and it typically works for the community. That strategy is far gone, far removed. The community first engagement is a must. At this time in our lifetime, if you're building a park, and I think Asima said at the beginning, if you wait until after your doors open, shame on you, you waited too long. And so any major large US MSA has dealt with these infrastructure racism of the past. And so we have an obligation to understand what we're dealing with. And I'll tell you, it's difficult work, man. HRNA did some work for us and created an equity toolkit. And this was probably a good, before my time, a good 3-4 years ago. And then even some of the findings that you and Brett was able to find aligned with some of those findings. And you know it, but when you see it, it's a different thing. And the challenge and the tension here, Stephen, is we have to work with a city who probably is a different city than it was 30-40 years ago. And we have to work with a city in figuring out, we have to raise funds from a capital funding point of view, you know, and whether it's a TIFA pit or whatever that is, and an existing relationship. At the same time, you know, we know there are serious issues to address, and we all struggle in this industry, especially as public spaces that cater for folks, is what's our stance on equity? And based on all this data that we had, what can we do? And some things we have control over that we know we can just jump on. One of the number one things that rose to the top was, all right, once you build this park, it's going to significantly have some impact on the real estate around. We have a small, not so small, West Dallas community, primarily Hispanic and Latino, and a Southern community. And what are you going to do about property tax stabilization? That's equity work that you have to get ahead of. Now, mind you, we haven't even broke ground yet, right? And so understanding our role, and I call it pushing and pulling, and what can we push on from behind, because it's not our role to play this civically, or what can we pull from the front and be bold and in saying we stand behind this, absolutely, and this needs to change. And I think that's a dynamic process of figuring that out, and even the support that you will get when there's a dependence on the city for funding, and how brash can you be You can't walk in with a big stick, but you have to be authentic and true to the cause and the community that you represent. So to answer your question, equity has to be a part of what we do, how it engages with the community before the first shovel goes in the ground. And there's a lot of survey that I have to give my predecessor, Brent Brown, and Walter Elcott and Alyssa Ismailian for the work that they have done. And the question now is, what do we do with that data and where we go from there?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, from this conversation and just from what I know about your organization, engagement has really been central to, I think, highlighting and amplifying the issues that go beyond the boundary, the site boundary of the park. I think this is one of the key things that people should be hearing from what you're saying, is that there is other work that is impacted by and influenced by the work that you're doing that you might not necessarily have a grasp on, you might not be involved in, you might not have the staff that have the expertise to do, but you have a platform, you have political agency. And if you make partnerships with the people that are doing work in housing affordability and economic development and all of the things that are outside of the park boundary, that those relationships really become an important way for you to be an advocate for those things and make sure the work you're doing is in support of and capturing value for, as opposed to sending sort of waves into the abyss that people have to deal with on their own.
Right.
And so, thinking about that community engagement piece and the partnership building, we actually, when we started working with you on the coaching, we were really focused on working with, and you were focused on and interested in building partnerships with surrounding communities, building more sustainable long-term partnerships that would allow you to be this sort of partner in advocacy, in project partnership, or even just standing by them and supporting what they're doing publicly and vocally. And so that really was looking at tools 12 through 15, which is really about the community partners, and starting with tool 8, which is really checking with who's included. But really quickly, when we started working with you, what became more apparent was that you needed to kind of look inwardly as an organization before you were going to be able to really make strong and meaningful partnerships. You were looking at how your budget was being allocated. You needed to look at where initiatives were coming from, where the ideas were generated, and really, in a deeper sense, who got to decide on what happens and how the park gets imagined and eventually programmed. And so you realized, that in order to be a genuine partner, you needed to understand your organization's internal power dynamics. So I want to sort of throw a question in that's already come from the audience, which is, how did your organization realize that internal power mapping mattered? What was it that made that shift from we want to build strong partnerships to no, wait, first we need to look internally and see how we are operating so that we can do better?
And I know we've had these discussions with the Highline Network before, is the leadership from board to executive. As we're lucky that we are starting from a developmental stage. We're not an existing entity that's tenured and institutional that has to adjust. So we had some unique opportunities in time with selections of board members. And I will say, page 55 in the Community First Toolkit says the feeling of wanting to fix everything. And we're such passionate individuals about equity and about the community, and it can become so overwhelming. And I think Walter Elcott said, and he's one of our board members, he says, we have to be clear about the role that we want to play. And I go back to the pushing and the pulling, and that starts initially with clear expectations. And so internally, the Trinity Park Conservancy really and strongly felt that we have an obligation to the community. Now, to say you have an obligation, and going back to your theory of action, where I say that's where the execution happens, you have to ensure that you're not just talk. And so I wasn't there at the time to do selections, but from the board, committees, and subcommittees, the selection of the individuals that you have to give them the commitment is critical, that will allow you to move these things on. You need a healthy sense of tension that will challenge the status quo for the right reasons, but the tension must still be strong, pure, but harmonious. You don't want to tear the system apart. But it boiled down, Stephen, to the leadership that we had and having the infrastructure that surrounded it. There may be some things that we couldn't necessarily figure out or had the expertise to figure out exclusively on the board that some subcommittees could respectfully challenge. I recently had a situation in which, as you start to map the power and who's making the decisions, and creating a sense of honesty in that culture of expression, we partner with our friends from 11th Street Bridge, and we had, thanks to them, some funds to do some workforce development work. And we were talking about it, and then I'm so busy patting myself on the shoulder that this was really good work. And one young lady that was heavily ingrained in the equity side of the community asked me, she said, did you reach out to the community and get, are you doing this because you have the funding, or are you doing this because the community wants this? And, I had a really gut check. Fortunately for us, we did reach out to the community, and they had a failed event prior to, and was very excited about this. But it's that type of accountability that's in the power structure, where there is the open ability to speak, to be listened, to be heard, and to be respected in a harmonious way where iron sharpens iron. And so a lot of that, Stephen, is the culture of leadership from the board chair all the way down, that provide this opportunity of expression and accountability. And if there's no accountability, we struggle. And really where we are right now is we have all this data that we haven't built yet. And so I'm on this brink where we now have to have something tangible for the community, because we have all this data that was collected 3-4 years ago, and we have to slow down because of some opportunities with the Army Corps of Engineers. So we're in this place where tangibility of execution is important.
Great. No, that's super interesting. And when we were talking about and we were preparing for this conversation, one of the things that came up was really trying to understand how the work with your organization actually impacted the development of the tools, right? Because you were in the first cohort, and there was a 2-year pilot, and the pilot and the conversations that we had with organizations, and that process is what led to the development and refinement of the toolkit. And so what's really interesting is that the work with Trinity Park Conservancy and that internal looking and that internal power mapping is actually what led us to develop that process that we've developed and refined and made streamlined for the toolkit. And we were able to deploy that with the other members of the cohort actually in real time. We used that mapping process in real time for our conversations with others. And then it became ultimately what you can see today as Tool 10, which is sharing power. So, one thing that you mentioned, though, that in the last part was communication and sort of, patting yourself on the back, but which is fine, but sometimes, it's premature, but it is good and it's healthy to sort of acknowledge your successes. And it's also, I think, important to document progress, both successes and failures, and to have metrics to really back that up. And if Anna, if you can put a link to the tools 16 through 18 cluster, particularly I guess tool 18, but even all of those which are about ensuring progress. It's about developing metrics. It's about documenting your progress. It's about building trust through transparency and shared progress. So maybe as a last question from me before we talk more to the audience questions, and actually this aligns with one of the audience questions. Can you share one or two things that Trinity Park Conservancy has advanced as a result of participation in the Community First pilot? And maybe while you're thinking about that and sort of talking about those things, one of the audience questions is, what are the challenges you face or you have faced or you are facing in telling your story? And if there are challenges, how are you managing those? So first, what are some things that you've done since being a part of the pilot?
So, toolkit 16, create your work plan, 17, track your work, and 18, tell your story, right? And so the tracking of the work is so important from a data point of view. You need that objective credibility as we share data. if not emotions take precedence, right? And so we had over 3,000 surveys conducted and over 7,000 different outreaches that we've had as a group over a period of time. And this is where, as mentioned earlier, the tension in saying, okay, what have you done with this data now, right? Because of where we are and some delays, we were not able, quite honestly, to operationalize as much as we wanted to. But I will say, understanding the different demographics, understanding the data as it pertains specifically. So it's a micro macro park out perspective in that close by, we knew who our demographics were. We knew their concerns, timestamped, mind you. And we knew some initiatives that they were looking for: clean and safe park, properly lighting, the sense of safety in what they do, a welcoming park, environmental trust in our rivers. It's safe to make contact with. Is it going to be accessible? Connectivity, the traditional areas that are part as operators of public spaces that we're concerned about. And so we started collecting data in that sense that's now starting to impact our design process and sharing that with our designers, Michael Lomberg and associates out of New York. And so important information sharing that will transcend into an end product. But at this point, and this is where the honesty comes in, it's been a while. And so we are eager to figure out more tangible execution. So, the thing that you often hear, and I have heard this sincerely, is, guys, don't survey me to death. Here's another thing: you want more data, you want more tangibility. Tangible, what are you doing with it? And if we don't do something with it soon, they're going to be a little strained in the relationship. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to pick up on that. There's two challenges. One is kind of over engagement without enough action based upon that engagement. That's what you're talking about in a way, is like people don't want to fill out another survey, and they haven't seen any of their feedback come to fruition. So that's one challenge. That's often a challenge with organizations that maybe have a little bit more resources and have the staff and the capacity to create those kinds of situations to do engagement. One of the questions here from the audience is about trade-offs. If there are limited funds and there is limited capacity to engage, how do you ensure that you can reach and hear from as many people as possible? I think that's one question. So that's like on the flip side of the challenge. One is like too much engagement. One is like, not enough.
That's right.
And so the question is, how do you make strategic choices that allow you to hear it from as many people as possible when you don't have all the resources at hand? And then the second is a second question, but I think it's related, which is how do you decipher qualitative information? How do you make qualitative information into quantitative data and metrics that you can actually use? People fill out a survey, there's 3,000 answers, as you said, and they're all people's answers. They're not multiple choice. How do you cull that into something that's useful for the design team and for your organization? So the first one is trade-offs and limited resources and engagement. The second is qualitative to quantitative.
Yeah. So the first question, Stephen, is, go back to know your audience, right? And that's a very macro, large, hairy. How do you authentically know your audience? Sometimes it's simply walking, talking, interacting. I call it beating concrete, popping in at community meetings, hearing in an objective manner, not necessarily an agenda that you're bringing forward. My experience has shown me that the more you're truly integrated in the community that you serve, there is a wealth of learning. Every time I go out in the community and interact, it may be casual, but you have to be a good listener and having the ability of discernment. And you will learn a ton just by hanging out without an agenda. If every time you come with an agenda, your information becomes skewed. They'll tell you what you want to hear, but you want to, and that you do not achieve that unless you have an authentic relationship. So to answer that is build authentic relationships. And what I will also say, be careful how you qualify the community, because sometimes you may have a sector of the community that you think represents the universal community, but it's not necessarily. And so you have to reach out to different segments, sometimes by culture, sometimes by geography, sometimes by political definition, and get their input. And universally, you're able to extract from that nuggets. And I'll stand by that 100%. Again, work for me in different communities by being active and authentically engaged, where you don't have money. Now, to your other question, in terms of quantitative data and how do you use that? I think it's twofold. In another life, there was a group called the Maury Group that had these kiosks. And the kiosk was just tell me about your experience, where are you from, what's your zip code, what's your ethnicity, household income. And it's a simple volunteer type of input. It costs about $24,000 to put about 3 of these units in. And in a former life, these 3 units were throughout the park. And every month we had a roll up of this data that you could extract: what zip codes, who is visiting, what did they like most, what did they not like most. And you have the ability to work with the Maury Group to specifically tailor to the needs that you have. Now, that's objective data collection. Surveys show that when you're in front with someone with a survey, your information often gets skewed because there's an attempt to either impress or not to be as honest. When they're objectively putting the kiosk, you get more honesty. So that's a more tangible, hard-to-work way of capturing. Then the other way is just talking to people, if in a very informal way. But how do you use this data? So the data is as good as the information you get, right? And what you do with it. And so data management of its own, sometimes it's best to hire a third party if you have the resources to figure that out. Sometimes it's simply being close to your product and people, as said earlier, and asking questions. But the application of it really depends on where you are and where you want data to move. There's some data information that's available via third-party census and all that type of stuff. So how do you actually execute it? It depends on where you are and how you want to use it. The other thing about data comes without emotion. And so you have to be careful too, that you're not just so bent on this is what the data says, and you don't have that emotional connection to the interpretation of it.
And that's,
I think that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's where the qualitative piece comes in as really important. And I have a colleague of mine, a senior colleague and mentor, Caesar McDowell, who's on a team in Boston, and I just drop a link in the chat, doing this initiative called Real Talk for Change. And they essentially are creating a database of qualitative conversations, and they are digitizing those and making those into quantitative information and actionable information for the city of Boston. So that might just be something for folks to look at that's interesting. There's one question that I want to slip in. I know we're tight on time, but I think it's an important one, which is, where is the space for expertise? So you're trained, you have experience. There's designers that you hire, they're trained, they have experience and expertise. Where is the place for expertise in processes when you're working with communities that don't trust experts? What is the role?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and dates back to that trust and that relationship, right? Sometimes when the expertise doesn't look like them, feel like them, speak like them, there's a further divide, right? And so I think you really have to understand the community needs as best as you can. And I call it endorsers. Get endorsers from the community that can usher you in. Qualify the third-party expertise, properly vet, and find a sense of endorsement where a community leader has buy-in in that selection. And so it's not just park or trail XYZ is bringing in this expert to talk to you who's from a market far away, does not have the lived experiences. It's critical that you get buy-in prior to, because from members of the community that has the respect and the ability to usher in. That's a tough one though, man. And you also want people that can speak the language, right?
Well, I mean, I completely agree. You know, when I sit around tables as a consultant and I look at who's at the table and we're talking to community members and we're asking questions about things that they know and that they are, in fact, experts on. And I see that everyone at this table, from the city side, from the nonprofit side, from the consulting side, are being paid for their time. And the community experts who actually are there and we need them are not. And so I think it's a good question. And what part of it is reframing who experts are and what expertise is. And so I'm going to pass it now to Asima because I've been people been pinging me that I'm going too long, but it's just because this has been such a great conversation, Tony. So thank you so much.
Appreciate
and
it, Stephen. Thank you so
pass it
much.
back to Asima.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Rebecca and James, Michael, Peter, for these really great conversations. You can see why it was important to us to ground this toolkit in actual practitioner experience. Don't leave me just yet. I have just a few points that I want to emphasize before we leave. First thing I want to say is the right time to start embedding principles of equity in your work is always now. It's never too late. We heard a lot of conversation about how obviously there's benefits to starting earlier, but if you, wherever you are, it's time to start thinking about equity in your project if you haven't. And we know this toolkit is a starting point and one that will evolve over time, and we hope that you will help us build that evolution. So we welcome all of your stories of how you're examining your own history, how you're centering equity or building partnerships. And we want these resources to grow over time with all of your experiments and successes. So you'll see throughout the website, there's the opportunities for you to submit your own stories, and we'd love to add yours to our collection. And we may even feature it on the website. So please let us know what works, what doesn't work for you. And I'll end with one request. Let's work together to make tools like these the standard for how we build public spaces. Let's get our funders and our partners, both public and private, to hold themselves and us accountable to implementing community-centric practices and partnerships to build our cities. If you're a funder, we hope you'll send this toolkit to your public realm grantees and ask, maybe require them to build these concepts into their work. If you're a park organization, public or private, use these tools to report your values and mission to your audiences and share how it goes with us. And if you're a community stakeholder, you can use this toolkit to hold your park organizations accountable and to ensure they're centering your needs every step of the way. So with that, a huge thank you to Urban Institute, to our speakers, and to all of you who joined us today. And you can always contact us with any questions or other ideas you have on how to use this toolkit in the future. And with that, have a great afternoon. Thank you.